class about the biblical Hebrew reader. You talk about classical Hebrew, and then there was an early Hebrew version. Now, the way I understand, given what you said, which is like the Song of Moses is early, so one way to understand it is that scribes would modernize certain Hebrew scripture in a more modernized version, but they would leave certain Hebrew scripture alone. And for some reason, that's one way I can look at it.
Oh, there are a few ways that this can be looked at. This is one of them. We know that what you said happened. We know, how am I so certain that this happened? I'm not saying that this is the only phenomenon and that's the only way to look at it, but I am certain that this happened. How can I be so certain it happens or it happened? Because when looking at the Dead Sea Scrolls, I can see the language of some of the scrolls is like updated. I see that sometimes they took words that were uncommon or unfamiliar or they, they thought would be are not like up to date, and they just updated it, the language. And we can see that it happened actually when we compare the Masoretic text to the Dead Sea Scrolls. So some of the Dead Sea Scrolls did practice exactly that phenomenon that you're suggesting. Now, does that mean that the same necessarily was done to other books of the Bible? It doesn't necessarily mean that this happened, because it doesn't mean, we don't have to assume that everything was written down exactly the same on exactly the same time. We may also bear in mind that all of the texts that are defined as early biblical Hebrew or archaic biblical Hebrew are also poetic texts. Poetic texts have an advantage of being preserved even when the language is a little bit outdated. So think of Shakespeare. Okay, if someone is quoting Shakespeare, Shakespeare's sonnets or poems that he had written are less likely to be updated, let's say, than stories. Okay, than novels. Okay, as far as the language, because poetry has oftentimes is cited by heart and is read aloud, and so it is a little bit more resistant to change. It's easier also to memorize, oftentimes, either because it has rhyme and meter or because it has short sentences or shorter certain sentences, as in biblical poetry. So while what you described certainly did happen in the ancient world, it is not the only way to understand the difference between archaic Hebrew and language that should have been from the same time but was not preserved in the same linguistic layer.